Can you guys hear me all right in the back? If I just talk normally?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Great. So the last talk I did was in the little Methodist church. And I was very disturbed to find out that the church had Baptist hymnals in it. Like, does everybody have the same hymnal in here? And they did, it's a Baptist hymnal. It's like, well, I don't know who committed that sacrilege. I don't think it was any of you all, but I was a little, I did find a Methodist hymnal in there. Somebody had stuck it like on the back corner of the broken organ. And they just replaced it with a I don't know what they're going to do next. Probably put a baptismal in there. But anyhow, it was a beautiful little church, and I hadn't had a chance to see it yet. So this is a log cabin. We started the last one with a hymn since we were in the church. It's like everybody turned to page 438. Sorry, Pastor couldn't be here this morning. But here in the log cabin, this is awesome. I was looking at this and said, I need this sort of a place for my family, I think. All these poles. Those are landscape logs. Authentic 1800s landscape logs. But thank you all for being here today. This is my third and final talk of this event, and I know it is cold, especially for Florida. So you're really brave to come out here. I went out this morning. I wasn't sure I would make it alive to my van. I was like, kids, if I don't come back in, I'm dragging a rope just in case. It was so cold. But I'm glad that you guys made it. So my first talk, I am listed as giving the same talk 3 times. But I can rarely do the same thing 3 times in a row. My wife knows this. We've lived in quite a few different places over the years. And I'm always trying something new. And in my first talk, we talked about why you can't garden in Florida. All of my talks relate to Florida survival gardening. But my first talk was why you can't garden in Florida, and the reasons where you've got the wrong plants, you got the wrong methods, and you're planting at the wrong time. Florida is a very unique climate. You got 2 major growing seasons. You've got the spring and you've got the fall. You have a very hot summer. Hot, humid, abundant rainfall. That's the rainy season in Florida. And then you have a winter that is dry. And it often freezes. People say, oh, you live in Florida, so like coconuts, right? Well, only in part of Florida. But Florida's climate is the top part of Florida could be Georgia, and the bottom part of it is Puerto Rico. So if you write a book on Florida gardening, which part? You'll enjoy growing mangoes in your yard. Well, if you say that, well, you can enjoy growing mangoes up to maybe around Okeechobee, and then it starts to get a little tougher to grow mangoes. Peaches are great in Florida. Well, you can do peaches down to about Orlando, and you get a little further south. Sometimes you just don't get the chill hours to actually get any fruit. So it's a unique climate, and it's all over the place. So we talked about the wrong timing and the wrong plants. We always try to throw plants at Florida that don't necessarily belong in Florida. They are not suited to the climate. If you have a husky dog and you try to raise that husky dog down in the Caribbean, he's not going to be nearly as happy as he would be in a cooler climate because he's made for it, he's designed for it. It's comfortable. And many plants are not comfortable in Florida, and they show you this by dying. I grew up in South Florida, so we had a lot of Quebecois, right? The Canadians, they would come down, and they would get horribly sunburned on Florida's beaches. Oh, it's so nice! I like the sun! And then like say next thing, they're like, they don't walk right anymore because they're so pale, they're not used to it, they're not used to the climate. If I went up to Quebec, I would die. I would die. It's like, how do you get ice off a windshield? These things, we're throwing plants at it, so if you have the wrong plants, there are plants that are on the invasive species list that are fantastic crops from Florida. There's a reason they love the state. They do really well. There's an invasive cucumber on the list. A cucumber that can live for decades. It's a perennial cucumber. Almost nothing eats it. But you can eat it. Now you try to grow regular cucumbers, you get little distorted, sad-looking cucumbers, unless you really work at it. You really have to work hard because it's not particularly suited to the environment of Florida. So timing, and then of course, methods. We plant raised beds because all the garden books say raised beds are the best way to do it. 2 benefits of raised beds, if you're reading the gardening books, they drain well, and they warm up fast in spring. Florida already drains well. It actually drains too well. My dad tried to keep his lawn in great shape, so he had this beautiful, he would always trim the St. Augustine grass, and he'd be out there prying out weeds. He would take the hose and he'd put it underneath the weed to work the roots out, and he'd pull the, but he had to fertilize it, because everything just goes through, it drains really well, and everything drains through, it just disappears. So trying to do a raised bed, it warms up fast. But you don't want it to warm up fast because we go from 50 degrees, 40 degrees to 90 degrees sometimes in a couple of weeks. And that really throws off your pak choi. Pak choi is like, done, it's over. So we talked about that. And then my second talk, we talked about trying to work with the soil and actually making the soil turn into something approximating soil, because it's not really soil. I called the backyard dirt once. I was like, I'm working in the dirt. Somebody says, don't call it dirt. It doesn't give respect to it. It's soil. I'm like, this is not soil. This is the stuff that construction companies throw away. It's just grit. It's just sand. It's this living web of the skin of the earth. I'm like, this part of the earth's skin, she doesn't show off much because it doesn't look good. She's gonna wear long pants over Florida. It's not great. So we don't really have that soil that you would love. And when you try to build the soil, it's very difficult to build. The humus burns out really fast. You put compost in the ground and it's gone. If you deep mulch, it makes that beautiful, rich, crumbly, black stuff underneath the surface for a while, but you constantly have to reapply. I put logs, they were cutting down a tree, and I took all these logs and I put them in my parents' yard. And the logs were rotting out into humus. Within 6 months, there was a layer of brown, rich humus underneath each log. They don't last very long. And then I went back, 10 years after we put those logs down, there's nothing there but sand. What happened to all that beautiful work we did? I put 3 feet worth of yard waste over that backyard 10 years ago, and you go back there and it's like a little sand dune where it was. I said, Mom, why aren't you raiding the neighbor's yard bins? You know you got to do that every 2 weeks. We don't have any soil. So we talked about that. We talked about improving with bringing minerals back onto the land with seaweed, using ashes and biochar, soaking charcoal, putting into the ground. Some of you probably saw Randall from Floribama's Homestead's talk on biochar. He's been experimenting with retorts. I like to do it the easy way, dig a huge trench, dump a bunch of stuff in it, burn it. When it gets about halfway burned, extinguish it with a hose, then take all the little charcoal that's left, put it in a bin, put in a bunch of manure, water, or you can even take like Peter's plant food or something and pour it in there, and basically you're just going to charge the batteries, right? Put elements into it, because if you put charcoal right in the ground, it does the same thing that if you take activated charcoal. Mom, the dog's throwing up. Give him some activated charcoal. He probably just ate that sandwich that we should have thrown away. So the activated charcoal, it soaks up the toxins and you feel better. And it also soaks up everything that's in the ground. It acts like a sponge. So if you till in charcoal into your ground, it will suck the nitrogen out of the ground, and then the next crop of plants, everything's all yellow and really sad looking for a period of time until it soaks up enough nutrients, and then it starts to become a battery for the soil. So we were talking about how we could possibly improve the soil long term. But most of my focus so far has been on annual gardening. And annual gardening is great. You get really quick yields out of annuals. Annuals versus perennials, right? I love the idea of perennial crops like chestnuts. I read this book called Tree Crops by J. Russell Smith. Really, really good book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It was written about 100 years ago. The guy was an inspirational thinking forwards of how we can stop tilling the ground and stop it with all this erosion and destruction. He was watching the tillers move across the United States, and areas that had been rich ground were eroded and the soil was washed away. And he was looking at the Dust Bowl and how things were, falling apart there. The problem is, perennial agriculture takes a lot of time. It doesn't necessarily take a lot of your time to do. But I compared it. I like chestnuts. He wrote about chestnuts. He said chestnuts are comparable to wheat in their nutrition, except they're gluten-free, so hipsters can eat them. So you got chestnut trees, right? You can make flour out of it, you can dry it. There's no erosion. They build their own soil over time. They're always dropping leaves. You can go and harvest chestnuts. I was like, I love that idea. Chestnuts, that's a pretty tree. You can grow chestnuts. Now they've got these blight-resistant chestnuts. They grow all over Florida. You can grow chestnuts. Nice, pretty sweet nut. You boil it, tastes delicious. They're really good. So I planted some chestnuts in my yard, and they said, well, chestnuts can bear in as little as 3 years. Well, that's pretty good. So I put some chestnuts in my yard. It takes about 3 years, and one of them blooms and makes a little chestnut. Look at that! That was 3 years for that. But it didn't take me much work. I just had to plant it, and then I put a little mulch around it, and ignored it. So I was thinking, okay, wait. I love the food forest idea. I love those long-term yields. I like the idea of planting a fruit tree when you're young and harvesting from it when you're old. Not having to always go through there and chop the ground and work your corn and try to toil your way to food. The idea of walking through a food forest and having the entire yard be this beautiful edible landscape is very exciting. And it's beautiful, and it feels like you've gone back to the Garden of Eden. But I was working on the second edition of Create Your Own Florida Food Forest. The little booklet. Who has that book? Anybody have the little booklet? Okay, so some of you guys have it. There it is. This is Create Your Own Florida Food Forest. This was the first book I wrote as a gardening book. And I was so excited about the food forest systems that I was building and had experimented with in Tennessee, South Florida, and North Florida that I was like, everybody's got to do this to their lawn. You've got to make a food forest. And so I wrote this little book, but I was working on the second edition of it. The first book is like a manifesto. It's like 14,000 words. Just do this, go, plan. It's awesome. And I still agree with it. So I've decided to write a really big. The new version of it is over 90,000 words, 200 illustrations. It's like 300 and something pages. It's a big fat book. But it has so many illustrations and so complicated that the book layout guy is just losing his mind over it. It's been months he's been working on it. Eventually it will come out. But it wasn't like I could just write it and write the words down and publish it myself. I actually had to get a guy that knew what he was doing to lay it out. I'm like, well, I got all these great illustrations and stuff. Got all these cool artists that put in art. And then like, actually, I don't really know how to lay this out. This is really serious. So I'm writing the book and I called Chestnut Hill Tree Farm. They grow chestnuts. They have a chestnut orchard from the 1980s. Beautiful big chestnut trees. They harvest them, they plant the nuts, they sell the trees, they graft trees, they sell chestnuts. Great, cool business. And they are the originators of the Dunstan chestnut, which is the best blight-resistant chestnut variety that I've ever heard of. Nice big tree, good sized nut, very sweet. I called Heather over there and I said, Heather, I'm working on the new edition of the book, and I love the idea of chestnuts as a replacement for annuals. Like as an annual, as a staple, you can make bread out of it, flour out of it, you could roast it and eat it, you're going to be full, you could store them. How much yield? I said, I know they bear in 3 years, and I was excited about that. I got, those chestnuts are coming in. I said, how much do they yield after, like what do they hit peak yield? Well, they hit peak yield maybe about 25 years old. What's the peak yield? Oh, I'd say we get about 50 pounds a tree. 50 pounds a tree after 25 years. Well, it doesn't take much work, but it takes a lot of your life. Ooh, I would plant them anyways. But I was thinking about this. What's this thing? Why do people go back to planting regular annual gardens? Well, it's because I can grow 50 pounds of pumpkins with one seed in 110 days. 1/3 of a year, I can get that yield out of pumpkins. Seminole pumpkins, that's a pretty hardy good food. What about potatoes? We grow a lot of potatoes. If I plant true yams, I could get a 29, 30-pound yam in 2 years. 10,000 calories by taking one little bulbil and sticking it underneath the dogwood tree that's silly ornamental. Why don't you be a trellis for something useful? You know, some of those crops are so fast that the food forest system, we don't often utilize the power of annual crops, because I think by our nature as humans, we tend to embrace one system so wholeheartedly that we don't see the uses of other systems, right? So when I say I'm not deep mulching my garden, somebody sees me tilling. I'm tilling this area and I'm planting corn. They're like, why would you till? The only way to do it is to back to Eden. That's the way God wants you to do it. And Charles Dowding. You know, like, oh gosh, Charles. You know, so you look at something, and you go, wow, it's we can't use the tools from over here and over here because we're completely dedicated to this system. I only do what David the Good says. You know, or I find you disappointing because I saw this documentary and it says that there's a lot of fungus in soil and you just killed like 1 million of them. You're literally a genocider of fungus, you know. So you look at these different. Did you ever read Teeming with Microbes? Yes, I read Teeming with Microbes. I've read a lot of these books and I tested a lot of these books. And you have to be willing to change or try different tools. A successful guy once told me, he said, don't be afraid to fail. If you're afraid to fail, you'll never succeed at anything. What you have to do is fail fast and gloriously. Fail over and over and over again on purpose. Does this work? People will say, can I plant an avocado in Georgia? Do it. Will it grow? Do it. See, you don't know yet. And you know what? If you really want to find out, plant every variety of avocado that you can find in your backyard, protect them for a couple of years, and then stop protecting them. When they get big enough, they might be frost tolerant. See, if one of them lives, then definitely you can grow an avocado in Georgia. People will tell you can't because they're afraid of the borders, the boundaries, those uncertain things where you might fail. You know, my plant might die. Well, that's okay. That's okay. You know how many seeds nature throws out for each one of those oaks that you see out there? How many acorns drop on the ground and get crunched underneath the wheels of the cars, eaten by the deer, rotten into the ground, eaten by squirrels? She might throw out 10,000 seeds to get one oak tree. So don't be afraid. The system is actually so abundant that you can fail in a bazillion ways and still succeed. Because if you hit that one thing that really works, this is how I found crops for the book, Totally Crazy and Easy Florida Gardening. I just kept throwing crops at the backyard and saying, I don't really take super good care of my garden. I don't want to spray. I don't like to spray. What will live if I don't intervene that much? And so part of the deal with Florida, the reason I really gravitated to the food forest concept to begin with, and I wanted to just try all the trees and everything I could find, is because most of Florida kind of wants to be forest. And in areas with very poor soil, annual agriculture is usually not the best bet. Usually, a lot of the fertility is actually bound up in the tree species. The trees are full of life and they have mined deep and they've managed to scratch out a life on this poor soil and are being productive on poor soil. This is why the slash and burn stuff that we see in the Amazon, they have really, really bad soil, but you have this incredible, these 200-foot trees, and it's this massive, dense, incredible ecosystem. You cut it down and burn it, and you can grow corn for a year or two, and then it's dead. It's all gone. Because it's made to be trees. Different environments are better for different things. The grasslands are great places to grow grasses like corn and wheat and rye. But Florida, if you strip everything off the top of the ground, you tend to get sort of sand dunes and some weeds, and then you know what? Nature tries to recolonize it and make it into forest again. If you don't If you have a foreclosure house, bit by bit, you get little oak trees popping up, you get a sumac growing out of the gutter, you know, you get stuff growing all over it, and it'll all turn into scrub again, and then they have to send, the bank will send some crew through there to try and chop everything down, and then cut it all down again, and try to get it on the market and put it in order to sell, but it keeps coming back to that. But if you try to clean your yard and grow a nice plot of sweet corn or something, and you don't do anything to improve the ground, it does horrible. You know, it wants to be forest. So the forest is kind of what Florida wants to be, but I want food production, like fast food production, because I have a family, and I don't really want to be so dedicated to this idea of I love perennials and I never want to till and I never want to do this and that and the other thing, that I get so stuck in a paradigm. You can be, Noah Sanders, who wrote the book Farming God's Way, he says sometimes we either become greedy for profit to the point where we just extract everything. We just extract from the soil. You burn through 16 feet of topsoil over, you know, over a couple of decades, like has happened in some of the Midwest. Just turn it, burn it down. He says, or you become so connected to the idea of preserving all ecosystems, everything needs to be a wilderness area, that you're not fruitful at all. So if you take a forest, the scrubby forest out here, people will say, well, you can feed yourself off the forest. Yes, you could leach the tannins out of acorns, you could eat some squirrels, you could harvest for chanterelle mushrooms and stuff, but it's hard. It's hard to feed yourself particularly well. Now, if you took some of that forest and you put in mulberries and chestnuts and Japanese persimmons and pears, and you planted yams around the base and stuff like that, you could make a super productive forest, but you're also not destroying the soil by just, let's say, you know, cut it all down, you burn it, you import fertilizer, you throw triple 13 on there, you spray everything with Roundup when the weeds come up, and then you throw more triple 13 down there and you spray the ground. You're basically just like, give me profits out of this land. That's not very good. But I was thinking, how could I combine, in Florida, which wants to be a forest, how could I combine some of the benefits of fast production with a food forest type system? And my food forests, I've done well. I've built multiple food forests in the state. I also built one down in the tropics, but during the pandemic, we ended up having to move back to the States, and just everything got crazy down there, so we moved back to the States. And I'm building again. But over the years, I've come across these interesting little tidbits of information, and they kind of all snap together in my head in the last couple of years. You're over here and you've got this food forest, and you're going to take 5 to 10 years to reach productivity. And now the food forest people will say you can grow some annuals around the edges of it. That's good, but a food forest system generally doesn't have a ton of edges, and it's sort of complicated and it's hard to manage the edges. One of the complaints that people have had about the food forest system is I don't know what anything is. You know, there's like 60 or 100 species, 150 species in here. And unless you are a plant geek, you know, like one of those guys with the long hair and barefoot, and they just walk through and they're just like, okay, so this over here, this is an herb from Southeast Asia, and this one is like a replacement for beard wax. And you're like, man, that guy knows everything. Those people could just live, you know, in their systems. But when a normal human being looks at it, they're like, I don't want to get poisoned. Are there snakes in here? You know, it's confusing. My wife likes things in orderly rows, and I like to go, live if you can! And just throw stuff out there. Who rules Bartertown? You know, so, but she's like, I like those square foot gardens. I'm like, what? Why did we have 10 kids together? Yeah, over the years, she has moved a little bit more towards, it's kind of fun to see what happens, and I've moved a little bit more towards, okay, mortal, I will give you lines and grids. Because there are real nice reasons why we like open spaces, we like straight lines and stuff. There's real ease of motion through a system like that. So if you were to combine the productivity of an annual garden with the wild, long-term, self-feeding, self-mulching abundance of a food forest, what would it look like? So I started playing around with ideas. There's this guy at, he's at the University of Oregon State University. And he built this really cool hedgerow. This is my edible hedge. And I always like the idea of edible hedges, right? You've got this space along the edge of your yard. One of those permaculture principles is stack functions. That means gets as many uses out of something as possible. And the little tiny house people, they do this all the time. This is my bed, and then the desk goes like this, and then I've got storage up here, and then I can pull this down here. Because we've got limited resources, limited space. Let's pack as many things in as possible. But you can get huge amounts of food out of a small yard if you know how to stack functions. So people often think of it in terms of one thing. I want a shade tree. So you plant a tree for shade. What tree has nice big leaves? I'll plant a sycamore. But if you planted a mulberry, you could also get fruit. Now there's like 1 month of the year where you maybe don't want to be in the shade a bit. So, and if it's near a sidewalk, you plant a white mulberry. You ever seen those? White fruit, no staining. They taste like honey. They're delicious, right? So you plant something else. So you stack functions. So if you've got a hedge, right? I want to divide my space from the neighbors. I don't like their parties that much, and I think their dog has mange. Right, so you're going to put up, so what people do, they go, I'm going to put up some azaleas. Okay, well, azaleas are great 2 weeks out of the year. The rest of the year is just like a block of green. Okay, you know, it's like kind of an olive drab block of green, kind of like, it's all right, but it's not that great. But if you could grow azaleas, you could grow blueberries. So you plant rabbit eye blueberries instead. Now you've got fruit, and you have a hedge, you have privacy, you have a boundary marker. But there's another benefit to it, and that is if you keep bees, you get all that blueberry pollen and nectar in the early spring when they bloom pretty early. So you get the bees are on there. So you got that's like 3 functions. But what if you don't want 40 feet of blueberries? Okay, blueberry, pineapple, guava. Maybe put a pomegranate in there, and you prune them all down, and then you've got this mixed hedge. I love that idea, right? You got this space that you would just use to block the neighbors, but instead you've got all kinds of fruit on it. That's cool. And another thing about that long line like that is it's all edge. The edges are the productive part of the system. Bill Mollison wrote about that in his Permaculture Design Manual years ago. The edge where the land meets the sea, there's a huge amount of activity. There's the land animals and the sea animals. They're interacting. There's a lot of churn going on in that surf. There's a lot of life coming in and out. There's seaweed washing up. There's man-o-wars coming in. There's birds fighting over the fish. There's a lot of life at the edge. At the edge of the woods, that's where you get all the worst brambles, all the smilax vines, the briars that tear you up and everything. They're right at the edge. There's blackberries, there's vines, there's flowers, and it's going from woodland to grassland. When you get further into the woods, it gets kind of empty. It's like that cavernous kind of feels like in here. You've got the trunks and it's dark overhead, and the woods have pretty much suppressed what's going on underneath. Out here in the grass has suppressed the trees. There's not as much tree activity. Trees don't do really well when they're in the middle of grass because the grass fights them. Grass puts out allelopathic compounds which inhibit tree germination if possible, and they try to fight the trees. They'll choke the trees out if they can. They kind of fight with each other. But right at the edge, it's not all trees and it's not all grass, so you've got this abundance of species. The birds pick into the grass, and then they go in and hide, and they've got their little nests there. So a hedge system has edges on both sides, whereas if you have a block orchard or food forest, you don't have as much edge. You don't have as much open breathing room space. So I said, what if you made a ton of edges? But what if you controlled it, right? So you make a really nice garden bed, a 4-foot wide garden bed, and you have a 3-foot wide path. That's a pretty generous path. But your 4-foot wide garden beds, you're going to make, like, really improve it. I have found that fruit trees, if you treat them like vegetables in the first year or two, if you treat them like babies and you love them, they grow so much faster and they fruit so much faster than if you stick them in the ground, you let the grass grow back around them. People are like, I don't know, I put that tree in 5 years ago and it's only this big around. Well, that's because the tree's fighting with the grass. It didn't get a lot of love and didn't get a lot of care at the beginning, and now it's just kind of going sideways. Look, if you let your kid just live on, bagels and Kool-Aid, they're not gonna thrive. They're just gonna be like, well, they're living, but they're not that healthy. So that tree is not even getting a bagel. It's just sitting there, and it's basically struggling along. But what I found was back in about 2012, 2013, I said, I have this really nice area that I've prepared in my gardens. I put in ashes, and I'd done some burns there, and I worked the soil up, and I built it as best as I could do with Florida soil. And there was this bed, and my daughter said, I want a place where I could plant flowers and stuff. And I said, well, if we put all that life right in the middle of the gardens, if I made a little contained bed and I put it in the middle of our annual gardens, it would get taken care of and it would get watered. Why don't you put your roses and your herbs and your flowers and stuff into a little bed, and let me plant a couple things in there too. I've got a couple of cool things I want to put in there. Maybe we'll make like a little food forest strip right in the middle. So I put in a Japanese persimmon tree. We put in some perennial marigolds, which are supposed to repel insects. They smell really kind of cool. And she put in a few different varieties of flowers that she had, and some roses. We put in some Mysore raspberries on one side, some goji berries over here. So we had this 4-foot wide bed that I had really taken care of. And it way outgrew and was happier. Those trees grew really fast. That persimmon tree, I had to prune it out a little bit, and all the stuff grew, and it had this beautiful little island of perennial growth right in the middle of my annual gardens because I was paying attention to it and I was treating it like I loved it. And there are trees that I had planted in the front yard that I kind of am like, I gotta water that tree, but I've gotta take the hose from where the kids were filling up that pool back there, and I've gotta drag it around the side of the house and pick it up, and nobody's got time for that, I got something else I gotta work on. Whatever's convenient. You work hard, but if it's in your pathway and it's where you see it and it's where your food is coming from, and it's like it's important to your life, you take much more care of it than you forget, oh shoot, that's it's 150 feet from the house, that one doesn't get care of. But that one right outside my back door when I go out with my cup of coffee in the morning, oh, I gotta get some aphids on the lettuces, and I start to take, you go out in the garden, you start weeding, and then you start watering everything, you take care of it. So the trees that get taken care of that were part of the annual garden or close to it did so much better than the ones that were further out. So I had this little bed, I thought that was very interesting. And then I watched Stefan Sobkowiak's film he did with Paul Wheaton called The Permaculture Orchard. And he's up in Quebec. And he got a commercial apple orchard, and it had just a couple of varieties. It was a monoculture. And he went through there and he says, I'm going to apply permaculture principles, and I'm going to start mixing up the species, and I don't want to have to spray for pests anymore. And he had a terrible time, and some of the trees died, and this thing happened, and that thing happened, and he worked his way up, and then bit by bit, the life started to come into it. He made his rows in between the trees. He put down a mulch strips, and then he had grass in between. Very wide, like real orchard spacing, real wide. Not a backyard sort of a thing, but a commercial orchard where people could go through and pick. And he put in plums and pears and other things in between. He put in elderberries and smaller berries and stuff underneath the trees, and he put up birdhouses. And he just let life come in. And the trees that didn't do very well, he let them die, and he replaced them with things that did do well. And I saw that, and I was like, I love that. It's not Florida, and it's not a backyard thing, but he said, I like the idea of being able to go shopping through your garden. Like you can just push a grocery cart, and you can pick from the tree. I was like, I love that too. That is a great idea. That is a great idea, but totally different set of species. And a couple of things he did, I like it even simpler. So I had this idea of this bed that had done really well. And then I read this book by Ann Ralph called Grow a Little Fruit Tree, which I've recommended multiple times. She wrote this book called Grow a Little Fruit Tree. Why do we let our trees get super, super tall where we can't pick them and take care of them and the birds eat the top of them off and everything else? She's like, cut it like right here. Cut it at your knee when you plant it. You're like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna kill it. Nah, you won't kill it. And if you do, fail faster, you know. Cut it right here and let it split. And then it's not quite so straight up. And then cut it again in the summer. Get it to go sideways. You can make a lot of trees into hedges. Ficus trees, down in South Florida, the ficus tree is a great big Ficus benjamina. They get this big and they have roots hanging out of them, and they're these massive, horrifying looking trees, but people use it for hedges as well, and people have them in pots in their offices. It's a ficus. It's only this big. You see them in the ground in South Florida, it can be 50 feet tall. We used to climb in them. They had bull ants that would climb up after us and we'd get higher and higher in the tree. They're gonna die, you know. Like, to get down, the ants are coming up. Drop, you have to drop, Dave. You know, they're in the park. We go up to those things all the time. But they could be contained in a pot this big or in a hedge this big by a diligent gardener. I like that idea. What if we made a series of hedges? We have a food forest idea. We've got our perennial fruit trees laid out in an orchard, but say a small orchard. Like, we're going to keep these, we're not going to let these trees get over. I want my wife to be able to go out and pick those trees without having to get on a ladder, you know. I want to be able to do this and then no higher than that. I don't want to have to knock them out of the tree with sticks. And I also don't want people to have a backyard space where it's consumed by one tree that drops 300 pounds of one variety of hard pear over the course of a week that you've got to process, and they feel guilty about it every year. We wasted so many pears. What if you had a pear tree that was this big and it gave you 20 pounds of pears, and then a couple of weeks later, this one's gives you a dessert pear, and a couple of weeks later, this one over here gives you a different type of pear. And maybe you start picking in summer, and you're picking all the way into when it freezes. What if you had, instead of one big, bushy, untrained peach tree with peaches all over it that squirrels steal, you have one or two, three, four different varieties with different chill hours. So you get a real cold winter, this type does well. You get a really warm winter, this one does well. Put a Tropic Beauty over here and a Florida King over here. 450 chill hours, 150 chill hours. This one does bad most years, except that year was a warm summer. Look at how many of those we got. This one does bad most years, until we got that really cold winter, and then it was loaded. The ones in the middle are kind of more balanced to your climate, right? The trees are actually not that expensive. Consider what the cost of produce is. You spend 20 bucks on a tree, well, you could spend 20 bucks on those nasty rubbery peaches that I got shipped. They don't taste, they're terrible. They're not, I didn't even know what a peach tasted like until I was older and I tasted a peach and said, this is why people eat it. We would get it from the stars, this bitter rubbery thing. Oh, it's horrible. Why do people eat that? Because it's like an imitation of what a peach should be. Wrong time, wrong season. So what I did was I said I'm going to make a series of hedgerows. Florida likes to be a living forest. Okay, so we're going to put an orchard in, and we're going to space the orchard spacing, but in between the orchard trees, let's grow annual vegetables. So we get their garden beds with fruit trees in the garden beds at about 12 feet apart, and then in between those, I'll stick like a berry bush at the 6-foot mark because it's not going to get too big. And then on either side of that, I've got my broccoli, my cabbages, sweet potatoes, onions, Everglades tomatoes, all that kind of stuff. All those little things, because here's another wonderful thing about being in Florida. Full sun in Florida doesn't mean you need the sun on it all day. Full sun is about 4 hours in Florida. That's good. And you'll know this if you go to the beach for 4 hours. You don't put on sunscreen. If you go out from 10 o'clock to 2 to 3 o'clock without a shirt on, oh my gosh, you'll be torched. It'll mess you up unless you acclimate to it over time or you have a skin tone that can tolerate it. I can't do that. So you don't need full sun to grow decent annual vegetables in Florida. So by growing underneath the trees, people are like, aren't you kids scared of the shade? And I'm like, no, actually a little bit of shade means your season can go a little further on some of those things. If you're not getting full sun on your broccoli or pak choi or whatever else you've transplanted, it actually tends to last a little longer. There's a guy in the Gainesville area I've read about who realized that if he grew mustard plants for the mustard greens underneath his pecans, he could get mustard for a few more weeks into closer to the summer than he did growing them out in the field. Plus then he got a pecan yield later in the year. So he actually, now he's stacking functions, right? All that empty space between the pecan trees. Some things don't like to grow under pecan trees. Some things may not like to grow underneath the fruit trees in the grocery row gardens. So I titled the system Grocery Row Gardens because I like that idea from Stefan Sobkowiak. What if you could just roll a grocery cart through your backyard garden? Instead of it being a commercial orchard that we're going and visiting and seeing, let's make a little one in our backyard and see how it works. So we're combining a ton of different permaculture principles. To make the beds, all you do is you go and fork up an area or till an area. I have one of those broad forks, it's 18 inches wide. And so if I do that too wide, it's almost 4 foot. It's pretty good. And so I will just fork the ground like this and rock it and pull it back. Some places in Florida you don't have to do that. But I have found that sometimes, like my place in North Florida, I planted a crop of barley because I thought I'm going to grow my own beer from scratch. Just in case the apocalypse happens, I will rule. I got my tobacco patch over there and beer. I can get people to put in fences for me and stuff. Like, please just bring it. I've got beer, you know. But the barley got about this tall and it started to just not look good. I'm like, what is going on? I gave it compost and everything. What do you want? Well, I decided to dig up a piece of it. I tilled the surface and it looked pretty fluffy, and I dug and I got about 6 inches down and it was like, oh, it's actually hard. And then you break it out and the sand was all stuck together really hard. Now, I think the people that had lived there before, they used to fix their cars in the backyard because I used to find car parts and stuff. I don't know if they just ran it over a bunch of times, or if it's just over time, you're getting beat by the rain and it's sinking and packing, just like if you shake a bunch of grain up in a jar and you do that, eventually it's going to pack down much tighter than when you first do it. Contents may settle during shipping. Like the cornflakes, why are there this many at the bottom? Doesn't make any sense. They're all broken, smashed. It's just like that sand, just get compacted down. So I just rough the area up. I found I rough the area up with a broad fork. If I have biochar, alfalfa pellets, if I have compost, a little bit of chicken manure, that kind of thing, I'll put it in just like I'm going to put in a regular annual garden. And I plant my trees first by pacing it off. And then I plant, in between, I plant berries, I plant medicinal herbs if I want them, and I have been putting in flowers. I put in flowers for a couple of reasons. People like to say, can you eat those? Because in the past I've said, why would you grow that? You can't eat it, I've gotten soft. But I plant them because they're beautiful and they attract the pollinators. So if it's like, if I'm talking to like a guy, I'll be like, yeah, it's for the pollinators. So, like the bees, so like I can make mead or something. But if it's a woman, it's like, I plant them because of the beauty, the maternal beauty of flowers. No, it's just sort of, there's a beauty to it, but it also brings in pollinators, and also the more you mix species up, the more the pests get mixed up. If you have one type of crop over a big area, this is the big problem with the citrus industry in Florida. Monoculture cropping, right? So it's like, hey, dude, they're giving out free food over there. No way. There's just like a field of it, right? Like the pests tell their friends, and they're like, let's bring the girls. And then they just fill, and they breed, and they fill the entire field from bit to bit to bit. Because, if you taste one thing, and you're like, oh, that's good. I'm going to eat more of that. And then you taste something else, you're like, oh, that's horrible, I'm not going to eat that. So then you start to look at the rest of the table like, I don't know if I want that. And that's what the pests do. A lot of them are very specific to a very specific species. And they will breed to fill and destroy that area. Nature does not really like monocultures except in very extreme environments. You have very extreme environments where you have one particular pine tree that pretty much covers the whole area. Or a gigantic mushroom that's just eaten the whole area. Like there's this huge fungi, honey mushroom fungus, that's been eating the woods out west. Bit by bit, this mushroom is just taking over this area. But there's still other species around it. Usually when nature sees something that's all together like that, she's like, something is way out of balance. Let's just smash that. Smash it down and a few citrus trees live and other stuff grows up. Sumacs and oaks and smilax and all the normal stuff will start to come back into it. So you put the flowers in there to kind of mix up the predators and or mix up the pests and attract the pollinators, and then the predators can hide under them. And I'm not tilling those beds again because they're now a perennial ecosystem. So I can take the time to build the soil. With the annuals, I want to get production out of the ground. So I don't usually deep mulch any annual areas. If you have a very small yard and you want to mess with deep mulching, it's great. If you only have a couple of people to feed, that's great. You can try that. It will build very nice soil over time, but the problem with it is if you try to get a substantial garden, like I had 11,000 square feet, and somebody's like, why don't you deep mulch that? So you know how much materials you have to throw around and how fast Florida eats mulch? It's insane. You could just be shoveling mulch all the time, whereas I could go out there and sprinkle on some compost and throw some ashes out there, till the area, and be planting that weekend, and I don't have to wait for chip drop to get back to me and drop a load of mulch chips. Different tools, different environments. What do you want to do? You know, so I can mulch those beds and build the soil and the fungal communities, which is really great for the fruit trees. Some of the annual vegetables, they don't really care that much. There are some fungal connections, but some of them really don't connect like the trees do. Almost all trees have connections with fungi that extend their root systems, often immensely beyond what the tree itself can actually root, and they will pump nutrients into the tree, and they will digest rock, pebbles, sand, and feed the nutrients to the tree. The tree is not able to do that. In return, the tree gathers sugars and feeds the sugars to the fungi, and the fungi actually pierce into the cells like this. Like if you see those trucks and they've got all the hookups down on the bottom, they're going to pump out the oil or whatever they're carrying. They've got these little connections, and they just go pierce, and they stick. They stick right into the cells along the roots, and they connect it, and they use their ability to digest materials that the tree can't, and they feed the tree. The tree digests the fungi. The fungi is sucking juice out of the tree, but they actually work together in this weird symbiosis. So that's one of those benefits of no-till, which is great. So you could do that and get your trees going. And then I just keep those 3-foot wide paths. Currently, I just use a wheel hoe, which is just it's got a little blade on the bottom and a bicycle wheel, and you push it along like this. I have used a hoe, and I know a lot of you guys are probably going to be in a backyard that is smaller than mine. The land that we're currently renting, I have about 2 open, clear acres to play with, which is the most I have ever had that's like open that I can do things with. And so when I designed the system, I made my system. I have 6 beds that are about 75 feet each. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 4-foot wide, 3-foot wide paths in between, and I overlaid an orchard on it, skipping trees every other row. So the trees are like this, and then there's like gap rows in between. That way, if I got really lazy, which probably wouldn't happen because I love cutting trees. I love pruning. I like chopping it all up. You can take some of the fruit wood and use it in the smoker, and then the other pieces you can cut it up. You make biochar out of it. Take all those prunings. You can drop the prunings on the ground underneath the trees and just let them rot. You can use the prunings to make stakes and stick things on them. But I'll go through there and clean it up. But I figured, you know, the landlord, this is their family property. And so if at some point in the future I decided I didn't feel like growing vegetables in between it, or much more likely I move away, I buy my own homestead, and I get gardening on my own land again, they could have an orchard in the backyard. If those trees grew out and got bigger, they would still be able to have a functional orchard that's not so close that it just gets overrun. My previous food forest system is in north central Florida, and I visited it a few years after I left, and it had all kind of grown together. What you have to do with a food forest is you really need to go and disturb it now and again, or else it starts to close. The canopy closes once you get the shade underneath. The stuff underneath doesn't grow so well. So what had happened was a lot of stuff grew up, and the nitrogen fixtures that I had planted to deliberately create biomass and add nitrogen to soil, I planted these real fast-growing trees. They're just dominating and shoving things over, and she's like, it's just too much work. And I said, did you ever prune it? She's like, no. Like, no, it's not that much work. You just have to go around with a machete. Like when you go out to get your mail, just bring a machete with you and just take a couple things down, you know? And not everybody wants to do that. So if it's basically an orchard overlaid on an annual garden, and I called it grocery row gardening. And we had some copies of the book at our booth. I couldn't find them before I came over here. I was going to bring some with me, but the kids assure me that there are more in the van. So if they aren't, you can find it on Amazon. It's called Grocery Row Gardening. And I will not say that any of my systems or ideas are the end-all system. You've got to look at your tolerances, what you like to do, what your yard looks like, what your climate looks like. Even different parts of Florida are very different. Is it exciting to you, the idea of making a series of like edible hedges that are long-term food with the medicine and everything? Then do it. But if not, you know, plant a regular food forest. Or plant an annual garden and work with some of the methods I was talking about on improving the soil or any of that. But I wrote the book. I built the first system down in the Caribbean, and I used all tropical plants. And then when we left that one, it was over my head. It was beautiful. We had cassava and yams and ice cream bean and mangoes and bananas and plantains and all these things that I had built and put in there. When I moved to Alabama, I was like, oh wow, I have to leave this garden. This is the most beautiful garden I ever built. Here I go, I gotta leave. And this guy said, the guy that was gonna rent the land from me said, it's the worst soil in the world. I was like, that's awesome. I was like, that is awesome. I get to start over again, and I'm going to rebuild the system as a temperate system in Zone 8 and get to do it again. And I get to work with the worst soil possible. Because if I can garden in horrible soil, I mean, so many gardening books are written by people with beautiful soil. Sometimes they have great soil to begin with, like in Southern California. Oh yeah, we just plant this and we plant this, and it's great. You can have a blend inside of your backyard. And you're like, that's nice. I wish I had soil like that. You know, that's why I feel like sometimes you see this beautiful soil, and then you get the beautiful soil, it's like, it's kind of boring. It's really cool when you start with something that looks awful, and you redeem it. Like, if you build a beautiful piece of furniture out of pallet wood, that's kind of awesome. Kind of awesome, it's redemptive. You take something that looks broken and beat and awful, and you make something beautiful. And one of the most beautiful things about having those perennials and the flowers and the medicine and having my little kids walking with me, my little daughter goes down there and she chases, she's 2 years old, she goes and she picks all the berries that are low. Sometimes when they're green, she just doesn't even care. She just eats them all. And I can go out there and it's beautiful, it's gorgeous. Go out there with a cup of coffee in the morning and say, thank you, Lord, for giving me this horrible soil. Amen. And allowing me to make something that turned out this beautiful just by looking at, you know, all these other wise people that I've read and seen and talked to, and there's so many cool things that we can do. And so I wrote this book after only a few years of building this system that was based on all of these different ideas, and I put it together and I feel like this is it, this clicked. This is the coolest thing. And so I wrote the book, I wrote the little booklet, and I said, look, if anybody wants to join me, this is an experiment. We are going to fail. We're going to experiment. We may plant the wrong trees, we may plant the wrong plants, but I know that the framework is good. Now we have to work out the bugs. So if anybody wants to join me, that's why I wrote the book. And I wrote it preliminarily because people kept saying, would you write how you did that? How did you make that awesome looking garden? All right, I'll write it. Because I don't really feel comfortable writing it until I've done it for years. Like totally crazy, easy Florida gardening. I've gardened and I've killed tons and tons of plants. I have so much chlorophyll on my hands. I killed so many plants to write that book. Before it was done, I was like a mass murderer of plants because I kept throwing things in the backyard so you gotta live. You gonna live? Oh, it's living! Look, oh no, it's dead. All right, I'll try something else. Plant 5 varieties of tomatoes, plant 5 varieties of pear, plant 5 varieties of cassava, throw yams back there. What is this thing that Vietnamese guy gave for me? What's the name? Oh, I can't even say that. Oh, let's plant it and see what it does. And then like, I've had plants and like 2 years later I find out what the Latin name is. I don't even know what it is. This guy gave me this plant, he gives me some crazy name I can't pronounce. Let's just see if it lives. So I wrote this book before the system is finished, and I said, anybody who wants to build it, all you really need is a 4-foot wide space with enough for a couple of trees here. If you did one with like 5 trees, right? So you had a little one like this, and then you had a middle one, 4-foot wide bed, 3-foot wide path, 4-foot wide bed. And you put 2 trees in this one, 1 tree in this one, 2 trees in this one, berry, put some herbs around those, and then plant your vegetable gardens in there and just keep the paths clear so you can walk through and prune it every once in a while. That's enough for a small backyard space. Like just this little area right here, you could have, see there's a grocery row garden right here, there's a grocery row garden right here, and then you can put another one right here to the other end of that fireplace. If you are keeping your trees pruned at this height, you could even get more. See if we're going to go 1 tree, 1 tree, yeah, so you can get 1 tree, 1 tree, 1 tree. It's a really fun and exciting idea, and since everybody pushed me to write the book, I wrote the little itty bitty book.
What's the name of that book?
It's called Grocery Row Gardening. But if you're not interested in that system, I will not be offended at all. I know how many things that I have screwed up and given bad advice sometimes because I've gone, oh yeah, that grows really well for me, and then somebody's like, well actually here we have these leaf cutter ants and they defoliate those things. Oh really? What would you do for them? I have no idea. I haven't dealt with that problem yet. Plant something else, you know, I don't know. So if anybody wants to join me in it, that's good. And I have a website, thesurvivalgardener.com, which has about 2,500 posts on it at this point. thesurvivalgardener.com, and it is mostly based on Florida gardening. And I try to answer as many questions as I can. I post there every weekday. I try to do a little post. I post garden pictures and things that people send me and different bits of things that I find interesting. My dad once drew a diagram, but this guy told him, he's like, I don't believe in God. My dad said, well, okay. And he goes, so, why do you believe in God? And Dad's like, well, I don't know. I mean, how about this? He says, he drew a circle on a piece of paper. And he says, let's say this represents all the knowledge in the entire universe. And the guy's like, okay. He says, how much of it would you say you know? And the guy's like, he draws a little circle inside of it. He says, this is everything. Remember, he's like, this is the periodic table of elements. This is every planet. This is every nebula. This is every grain of sand in the Dead Sea. You know, everything. Everything. And he's like, the guy goes, he says, wow, that's pretty generous. And my dad's like, puts a little pinpoint. He says, I probably know that much. He says, God might be out here. We don't know. He says, just because we don't have it inside of our experience doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So I like to experiment a lot, and I have to say I have learned more from interacting and trying to look things up and figure things out and killing things. So if you're struggling with Florida gardening, don't worry about it. I've got a ton of answers on the website for the things that work for me, and I am very happy to have any of you join me, and you can follow me on YouTube. I'm 4 miles from the Florida border now, just over the Florida border in Lower Alabama, Zone 8, and it's still similar enough to Florida gardening that I don't feel completely and utterly lost, but that's as far north as I ever want to move.